Brendan Dassey Trial Transcript Day 1, continuing on page 44. Now, you heard about Sherry Culhane. You heard about her doing some DNA work in this case. Now, you're going to hear that Ms. Culhane received from law enforcement 180 items of evidence where officers asked that a DNA profile be developed. You're going to hear that that is the largest submission of evidence ever at the Wisconsin State Crime Lab. And that the amount of DNA work in this case was absolutely overwhelming. Ms. Culhane, and although not as important in this case, will still tell you about all of the profiles that she was able to develop. She'll tell you what DNA is, and it's a genetic fingerprint, and how you can make matches and all those kinds of things. All right. With that having been said, though, you're going to hear that one of the bones that was recovered in the pit still had some tissue on it. So it had some muscle tissue on the bone. It wasn't completely burned. It wasn't completely degraded. This allowed Ms. Culhane to develop a DNA profile and, in fact, positively match this leg bone to the sample, to the exemplar, to the standard of Teresa Halbach. So after that bone is examined, and after a DNA profile is established, there isn't any more question as to who this female skeleton is. This mutilated, fragmentary skeleton belongs to, and that is, with 100% certainty, Teresa Halbach. So the investigative timeline, that is, the first 8 or 10 days of this case, includes. These aren't going to help you because we have stuff on the bottom, so you're going to have to look forward. Again, I apologize for that. That will be fixed at the break. But on the 31st of October, Teresa Halbach is killed. You're going to hear about the timeline of October 31. You're going to hear that at 8:12 in the morning on the 31st, Stephen Avery lures or calls Auto Trader magazine, and Teresa Halbach is asked to come out to the scene. You're also going to hear she'd been there 5 times before, but always with the name of Stephen Avery. At least I think that's what the evidence is going to show. But Mr. Avery used a different name, that is B. Yonda, to get her to come out on the afternoon. You're going to hear at 11:43 that morning, so sometime just before noon, Teresa Halbach makes that call that's recorded to Brendan Dassey and Barb Yonda's answering machine saying, "I can come out. I'll be out there sometime after 2 today." You're going to hear about the 2 stops she made before Stephen Avery's and Brendan Dassey's residence. That is at the Stephen Schmidt's residence at about 1:30, and sometime between 2 and 2:30 at a woman by the name of Joellen Zipperer's. The similar kind of stops. She stops, she takes pictures of the cars, she gives them an Auto Trader magazine, a bill of sale, she completes the transaction before taking the photo for Auto Trader, and then she goes on to her next stop that day. Well, her next stop that day was that of at the Stephen Avery salvage property. You're going to hear at 2:27 p.m. a woman from Auto Trader, Dawn Pliska, talks to Teresa Halbach. You're going to hear that during that conversation, Miss Halbach says, "I'm on my way. I'm on my way to the Stephen Avery property." So when we talk about a timeline, when was she there? About when does she get there? You're going to hear that the Zipperer residence is less than 10 minutes from the Avery property, and if at 2:27 she says, "I'm on my way," it can be no longer or later than 3:27 or about 3:40. 2:27 or about 2:40 in the afternoon, 20 to 3, that Teresa Halbach gets to Stephen Avery's property where the photos are taken. You will hear evidence that she completes the transaction. She takes the photos of the van just like she's been asked to do. You will then hear, in unfortunately graphic detail, what happens at Teresa Halbach after 2:40 in the afternoon. Let's go back to the investigation for just a minute, though. Teresa doesn't show up for work on the 1st or 2nd of November. On the 3rd, the Halbach family and friends become understandably concerned, and they begin to retrace Teresa's steps. Where is Teresa? How can we find her? On the 4th, both the citizen efforts and the law enforcement efforts to find Teresa are kind of ramped up. They do aerial searches. They look at financial transactions. They check out her cell phone records and which towers that her cell phone kind of ping off of or bounce off of. And also you'll hear about the distribution of missing person posters at that time by citizens. You'll hear that on the morning of the 5th, her vehicle is found at 10:30 in the morning by the Sturms. At about 2, investigators become actively involved in searching, or at least in obtaining search warrants and then searching the property. And you'll then hear about the searches continuing. Very quickly on Sunday, the firearms and garage is searched, and you'll hear about the evidence that is obtained. On the 7th, it becomes more full scale. Lots and lots, in fact, hundreds of law enforcement officers and volunteers and citizens become involved in the search of this massive 40-acre property. At that time, all the junked vehicles are searched, and you'll hear about the discovery of the burn barrel. On the 8th, those 3 critical discoveries that we talked about, that is the Toyota key being found in Stephen Avery's bedroom, SUV plates are found at that time, and the burn area is discovered, which, contains those remains. The 9th becomes an important day. Stephen Avery's arrested. Stephen Avery's arrested for a weapons charge. On the 9th, he's interviewed. But what you'll also hear about the Stephen Avery contact on the 9th is that officers take some photographs. They do a physical examination of Stephen Avery, and they find a cut that you'll see in just a few minutes. On the 10th, the burn area is further examined. On the key itself, on the key that was found in Stephen's bedroom, they find his DNA. We'll talk about that a little bit further. On the 11th, the victim's blood, that is the female blood from within the SUV. Remember the big pool or the big stains in the cargo area in Teresa's SUV? Those now match a soda can that Teresa had up in the front of the vehicle. It's then presumed to be that of Teresa Halbach's. So those are the first 8 days or so of the investigation and what you need to know. Again, that's probably, 2.5 or 3 weeks, or could be, of testimony that, in this case, we're going to try to fit into a layer of evidence, try to fit into about 2 days, maybe 2.5 days. So it's going to go quickly, but it's meant to give you a flavor of the size of this case, the scope of this case, and also to the credit not only of the Halbach family and to the memory of Teresa, but you need to hear it. You need to hear the whole story of the investigation. We talked about those DNA matches that Ms. Culhane developed at the crime lab. You're going to hear that Teresa's blood is in fact later positively identified, positively matched to a standard in the cargo and panel area. The back cargo door, you're going to hear about blood having been actually flung onto that door. You're going to hear from a person by the name of Nick Stalkey, a blood spatter expert, as to how those kind of blood spatters can be left in a very violent kinds of episodes. You're going to hear her blood was found on the rear tailgate, the door handle, and again on the soda can. Stephen Avery's blood is found, like I told you, in 6 different places in the vehicle. Positive matches for Stephen Avery on the rear passenger door near the ignition area where Stephen Avery's actively bleeding finger actually leaves some DNA in the ignition area. Also in the front, that is the front passenger part of the SUV, that is on the CD case and on both of the front seats. I told you before about the cut, the actively bleeding cut on Stephen Avery on the 9th. We will show you pictures of the remnants of that cut. It was healing, but just how deep that cut was. And you can draw the conclusions, and in fact, it may or may not even be contested that his finger was actively bleeding on the 31st when he struggled with Teresa, and when he loaded her in the back of the vehicle and helped and dispose of the vehicle to conceal that particular crime. And finally, you're going to hear evidence of the DNA of Stephen Avery being found on Teresa Halbach's key. You're going to hear about how DNA is the same, whether it's in your blood, whether it's in other bodily fluids, perspiration, skin cells, semen, other kinds of places. It's the same genetic code. It's the same DNA that's found. And when Stephen was handling that key, he left his perspiration. He left his sweat on that key. And Miss Culhane, was able to develop a full profile. All right? Everybody take a deep breath because we're now going to start talking about the reason that you're here. That was all of Stephen Avery's case, where the evidence that pointed, to Stephen Avery. This is going to be a time when the judge is going to allow you to take a few-minute break, your morning break. After you return, we will then tell you about what evidence it is that the state intends to show and why it is that the state intends to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that that man, that Brendan Dassey, committed the crimes of first-degree intentional homicide, mutilation, and sexual assault. So if we may judge a 10 or 15-minute, the court, certainly, Attorney Kratz, break at this time, and when you come back, I will conclude my opening statement. Thank you very much. The court will recess for 15 minutes. Recess had at 10:13 a.m., reconvened at 10:32 a.m. Attorney Kratz, the screens have been fixed. The reason we're here is for Brendan Dassey, for the jury to consider Brendan Dassey's behavior, that is, whether he participated in criminal activity. Criminal behavior. The judge instructed you that you're going to be able to take notes during the testimony in this case, during the presentation of the evidence. And as you take notes, it oftentimes is a suggestion from the lawyers, Mr. Freeman or Edelstein, or whoever is giving their opening statement, may have suggestions for you as well. But in note-taking, in taking detailed notes, which you're going to be able to use during your deliberations, the two questions, at least, that the state is going to ask or present evidence that's going to ask you to answer are these. Number one, was he there? And number two, did he help? Was he there and did he help? On November 6, Brendan Dassey, right after this case began, right after the investigation began in this case, denied any knowledge of Teresa Halbach's death. Indicated some version that he had seen his uncle, Steve, talking with Teresa, but the investigators pretty much discarded that because it wasn't consistent. It didn't fit with the timeline, didn't fit with the evidence. Remember, Teresa got there about 2:40. You're going to hear evidence that Brendan didn't get off the bus from school until 3:45, a full hour after that meeting, after Teresa would have been talking out on a porch with Mr. Avery. And so Brendan was nowhere on the radar screen. He was nowhere a suspect. He was a witness, like any other witness who might have been on the property. That tends to change on February 27 when Brendan starts giving new details. He's re-interviewed based upon some other information that was obtained by Mr. Fossbender and Mr. Wiegert, and he then becomes a much more important witness. He's a witness at this point. He says he sees Steve standing near the fire. He sees body parts of Teresa Halbach in the fire. He helps put fuel on the fire to help kind of stoke up the fire, if you will. And Uncle Steve makes some admissions that Uncle Steve stabbed Teresa Halbach, but that also that Mr. Dassey saw some clothing. And interestingly, he said he saw Teresa's clothing in a bag, and he saw them in a bag in the garage. Well, as officers, you will learn, kind of reconstructed that February 27 statement. They started saying, as investigators do, well, wait a second, that can't happen that way. How can he describe Teresa Halbach's clothing if they're in a bag? Forensic interviews you'll hear testimony from investigator Mark Wiegert, are designed for witnesses. Witnesses give interviews, and forensic interviewing, you will hear some version of what's called the funnel technique. And I'm not going to bore you right now because I'll let Mr. Wiegert bore you later with what the funnel technique is. The theory, though, is that witnesses, when you're trying to get details, the evidence will show is that you start with a free narrative, a narrative. Tell me everything you know about what happened in the case. And then it becomes more and more directed. You can ask direct questions or more focused questions, or even in the rare case, you can ask leading questions to try to draw out of witnesses what they know about the case. That makes sense. It makes sense that you want them to tell you everything, but you're going to have to follow up with questions. You're also going to hear, though, that there's a difference between interviews and interrogations. Interrogations are designed for suspects. They're not designed for witnesses. And you're going to hear in this case, in fact, you're going to hear a lot in this case about interrogations, about the interrogative process, about the process of asking questions and the process of obtaining truthful information from suspects. You're going to hear that confessing to a crime, and in fact the most serious crime is murder, but confessing to any crime is an unnatural act. It goes against a human's feeling of self-preservation. Okay? That should make sense to everybody, and the evidence is going to show that it is difficult to have somebody admit to a very, very serious crime. And so there are techniques that are developed to encourage suspects. Again, these are interrogations. These aren't interviews. But to encourage suspects to provide truthful information. You're going to hear about those techniques, that those techniques include some kind of an accusation that the person's not telling the truth, and in every confession, every admission that Mr. Wiegert and perhaps other witnesses will tell you about, they always start with a denial. I wasn't involved in the case. You will then hear how confessions or admissions move from denials to admissions. It's called shifting from denials to admissions. You're going to hear about the stages where an individual will become in a very passive mode, will allow the investigator to do most of the talking. In fact, you'll hear about body language and looking down and really kind of allowing the investigator to give their version about what happened. And you will see a point. They'll describe a point, that is, investigators will describe a point in every interrogation where this happens, but in Mr. Dassey's case, you will see a point where that first admission occurs, the first acceptance of some responsibility for being involved in the case. All right? Then the rest of the interrogation is drawing out as many details as you possibly can.